All right, so our math goal is to predict if the product of our multiplication of fractions will be greater, equal, or less than the factors that are being multiplied. So we did a little bit of this in lesson 3-7, so a couple of lessons ago. So write down what you remember about if our answers will be greater, equal, or less than the factors being multiplied, then come back to me. Okay, so let's do a little review from what we learned in lesson 7, okay, about multiplication of whole numbers and multiplication of fractions. So let's just review. So you should have this already in your math notebook, so you don't need to write it down. So remember we talked about what happens when we add two whole numbers, right? So we said when we add two whole numbers together, our answer is going to be greater, right? Because you're combining things. Then we said if you're subtracting two whole numbers, your answer is going to be smaller than what you started out with, right? Because you're taking something away. We also talked about multiplying two whole numbers. So if you multiply two whole numbers, the answer is going to get greater, right? Because in essence, you're adding, right? Because you're adding groups onto groups onto groups. So that's what multiplication is, a fast way of addition. So it's got to get greater. Okay, when we add fractions, right, it's got to get greater also than what you started out with, right? Because you're adding more onto it. So it's got to get bigger. Subtracting fractions, same thing, right? If you're subtracting fractions, it's the what you end up with has to be less than what you started out with because you're taking it away. But remember that when you're multiplying fractions, the number gets smaller, right? It's not like multiplying whole numbers. Multiplying fractions get smaller, remember, because you're taking a part of a part. So you're taking a part of a part, so it's got to get smaller, okay? So keep that in mind as we do these. Okay, so let's predict and solve. If the product will be greater or less or equal to the second factor. So if I multiply these out, is my answer going to get bigger or smaller than my 3/4 and the one in red? So what do you think? So maybe you should be thinking it should get smaller, right? Because if you're taking a part of a part, it's got to get smaller. So let's see what happens when we do that. So when I did that, I did predict that it was going to be less because you're taking a part of a part, you're taking a part of a fraction. And so when I multiplied it out, I ended up getting 6/20, which ended when I reduce it, right? If I reduce this, it ends up being 3/10. So 3/10 is smaller than 3/4. 3/4, you're only one away from a whole. 3/10, you're seven away from a whole. So 3/4 is bigger than 3/10. So the answer did get smaller. All right, let's take a look at this one. So what do you think? 6/6 times 3/4. Is my answer going to be greater, less, or equal to 3/4? This one's a little bit tricky, but if you remember that 6/6 is the same thing as one whole, right? 6/6 means one. So when you multiply one times anything, it's always the other number, right? So if I multiply 3/4 times one, it's going to be 3/4. So they are equal. So don't let that fool you, right? Remember, anything multiplied by one is always the other number unless you're multiplying it by one times zero, right? And then it's going to be zero. That overrules it. Okay, let's look at another one. 1/3/7 multiplied by 3/4. Is my answer going to be bigger or smaller than the 3/4? What do you think? Because I have a whole, right? So if I have a whole, that means I'm multiplying by more than one, right? So if I have my whole, then it's going to be a little bit different, right? So notice I went ahead and I multiplied it out. 1 3/7, I changed it, right? I got to turn it into improper fraction. 1 times 7 is 7 plus 3 is 10. I changed it to 10/7 times 3/4. I multiplied it out, numerator times numerator, 10 times 3 is 30, 7 times 4 is 28, 30 over 28, which simplifies to 1 and 2/28, but I can go further, right? Because I can divide 2 by 2 and I can divide 28 by 2. So I divided top and bottom by 2 and I got 1 and 1/14. So 1 and 1/14 is bigger than my 3/4. So why is it greater? Because you have more than one whole. So anytime you have a number that's more than one whole with a fraction, then the answer has to get bigger because you're multiplying by a whole. It's like multiplying a whole times a whole, but this time we're multiplying a whole times a fraction. Because of the whole, it's gonna get bigger. So hopefully that didn't fool you. All right, so you try one. Predict and solve if the product will be greater, less, or equal to the second factor. So write it down in your math notebook. Predict first before you solve it. Predict if it's going to be greater, less, equal, or greater than the second factor here, and then come back to me. All right, so hopefully you said equal, right? Because 3 over 3 is the same thing. 3 divided by 3 is 1. So it's 1. So you're multiplying by 1. So anytime you multiply by 1, it's going to be the same number unless you're multiplying by 0, right? So hopefully you said equal because anytime you multiply by 1, it's the other number. So it's 2.5. So they are equal. All right, try another one. Predict first, will the product be greater, less, or equal to the second factor? So it's going to be greater, less than, or equal to 2.5. 2 and 2/3 times 2 and 1/2. So go ahead and pause the video and do that one and then come back to me. Okay, hopefully you said greater because you have a whole times a whole. It's going to give you a bigger number. Notice I have a whole in front of both of these fractions. So my whole times my whole is going to tell you that the answer has to get bigger. And then I went ahead and I multiplied it out. I turned this into an improper fraction. 3 times 2 is 6 plus 2 is 8 gives me 8/3. 2 times 2 is 4 plus 1 is 5 gives me 5/2. Now I can see that 2 can go into 8 4 times. 2 goes into 2 one time. 3 does not go into 5 or 3 does not go into 4, so I'm done. I just multiply 4 times 5 is 20. 3 times 1 is 3. And it gives me 20/3. So I got to divide 20. 3 goes into 26 times, so it gives me 18, 19, 20, 2 more. So it gives me 6 and 2/3. So you can see it is way bigger, right? Because I have a 2 and a 2. I have two whole numbers. Okay, try another one. Predict and solve if the product will be greater, less than, or equal to the second factor, which is 2 and 1/2. So 7/8 times 2.5. What do you think? Greater, less than, or equal, and then solve, and then come back to me. Okay, so did this one trick you? Because you have a whole number, but you are taking part of the 2 and 1/2. You have 2.5, but you're taking part of that 2.5. You're taking part of it. You're taking 7/8 of it. So that's why it's less because you're taking part of the 2.5. So I went ahead and did this one to show you and see if you got it. You also would have seen that it's less. 2 times 2 is 4 plus 1 is 5, 5/2. 2 doesn't go into 7. 7 doesn't go into 8. 5 doesn't go into 8. So then I just multiplied out. 7 times 5 is 35. 8 times 2 is 16. 16, this is 35 divided by 16. So 16 goes into 35 2 times, gives me 32, 33, 34, 35, 3 more away. 2 and 3/16. So that is less than 2.5. Okay. Okay, so you're probably thinking, so why was this one less and the other one wasn't? This one was less because you're comparing it to the 2.5 and you're taking part of that 2.5. Let me show you the other one and why it was greater. Okay, so this one was greater because you were comparing it to the 3/4, not to the 1 3/7. Okay, and the other one, we were comparing it to the bigger fraction, and this one we're comparing it to the smaller fraction. That's why this one was greater. See, in this case, we were comparing it to the 2.5. That's why it was less. We weren't comparing it to the 7/8. If we were comparing to the 7/8, then it would have been greater. So it depends on which fraction you are comparing it to. So gotta pay attention to that. All right, so what did you learn today? So write down what you learned, write down a proof of learning by solving a problem that's similar to the one we did, and then do a reflection or a question you may have.